My dog is dead, and his final resting place is at the spot where the woods meet my backyard. But this wasn't where I buried him first. I live on the top of a hill on 100 acres of land I inherited from my parents, who in turn inherited it from their parents. I have no wife, no kids. For the past 10 years, my only company had been Bruno, my recently deceased English bulldog, and I guess I'm here writing this because I feel a bit lonely and wanted anyone to hear the story of his passing and tell me what they think of it. I myself am not too sure what to make of it at all. As you might have guessed, I live in the middle of nowhere, Box Springs, Georgia, namely. I live off a highway surrounded on one side by twisted jumbles of trees and on the other by a sea of parched, dying farmland. If for some reason you came to visit me, you'd leave my little green house by trundling down the hill, want to hit civilization, that is, as most people do. After driving left on this highway, and you'd be on your way to the city, though you'd be met with one or two uncanny sights on your way there. Not long ago, one such sight would have been a faded and crumbling brick chimney, which stood all by itself on one side of the highway, a remnant of a house that once stood there. Next to where the chimney once stood, there are a set of trailers that sit flat on the grass and always seem well maintained, though in my 10 years of passing by them on the highway while driving to or from town, I've never seen anyone go into them, or come out of them for that matter. As such, when I lost Bruno one sad summer day, I wasn't afraid of anyone trying to stop me when I decided to visit the chimney and use it for its legendary purpose. When I was little, my grandma used to tell me stories about this old chimney on the side of the highway. She called it the Soul Stack. Local legend had it that if you buried someone at the foot of the chimney immediately would begin to emit a plume of green sapphire mist that would spiral ephemerally into the air, as if the chimney were lifting the departed person's soul to heaven, or if you like, to the stars. Grandma was one of those rare rural atheists, and many of her relations worried about her eternal fate up until the day she died in her old bedroom, which then became my parents' bedroom and now was mine. I always heard whispers of my grandma being in hell as I was growing up, but I didn't heed such notions. Grandma could be crotchety and outright mean at times, but eternal torture in a realm of eternal fire didn't seem justified. I accepted that my grandma was probably nowhere except in the ground, and later I accepted the same thing regarding my mom and dad when cancer and a car accident prematurely claimed them respectively. But when I woke up to find old gray Bruno lifeless on the couch one morning, I couldn't bear to think that his ultimate fate was to be eaten and shat out by worms. So, after a good, long, hard, ugly cry, I scooped my poor little buddy in my arms, along with a shovel, and I decided to see if there was any truth to the legend Grandma told me. I did it in broad daylight. A car whizzed past on the highway only every now and then, and even if someone did spot me, who were they to assume I was trespassing? For all they knew, I could be the occupant of one of the trailers sitting next to the chimney. I wasn't afraid. I wrapped poor Buddy in his favorite blanket the fluffy but not too fluffy one with Winnie the Poohs and Tiggers on it. I placed him gingerly in the passenger seat of my car, and I made the journey to the Soul Stack. I parked adjacent to the trailers. I glanced at them for several moments, waiting for someone to come out of one or both of them. When no one did, I climbed out of my car and gathered up Bruno. I then marched toward the chimney to perform the simple ritual. The chimney stood towering over Bruno and me, looking much larger up close. Whatever house it had once been attached to must have been a big home, a Civil War era mansion or something. I set Bruno on the ground carefully and continued to regard the chimney, which appeared as an ancient monolith clutched with ivy and somehow seeming sturdy and imposing, even though it looked like it could easily be knocked down with a big forceful push. In the center of the chimney's face, some bricks were missing, giving the impression that it had eyes, and these eyes looked angry. The flue seemed to stretch open like a screaming mouth or a hungry one. After a moment of heavy breathing and trepidation, I took my shovel with trembling hands and impaled the ground immediately in front of the chimney. I scooped out a big chunk of earth and flung it behind me. I did this several more times until I fashioned a grave I thought was suitable for Bruno. Then, struggling not to cry afresh, I lowered little Buddy into his dirt bed and began to cover him. After the deed was done, I sat in silence, my watery eyes glued to Bruno's grave. Then something tugged my vision up to the sky. I'd almost forgotten the legend entirely, but it seemed the chimney wasn't about to let me forget. I gazed with amazement as wisps of smoke began to issue from the top of the chimney. Whether they were green or sapphire, I couldn't tell because of the brightness of the sun, but by God, there was smoke coming out of that chimney. I got to my feet, standing on my tiptoes and squinting and shading my eyes with my hand to try to get a better look. I found myself stepping on the exact spot where I'd buried Bruno, and to my shock, I felt my feet begin to sink, as if I'd wandered into a pit of quicksand, and in the next moment, the ground shifted underneath me and gave way, and I found myself plummeting into the depths of the earth. I landed on my stomach. I gasped, trying to take back in the wind that had been knocked out of me. I coughed. I blinked rapidly. After taking a moment to recover from the shock of what just happened, I stood up and dusted myself off. Looking up, I saw the hole I had fallen into was maybe 5 or 6 feet above me. I searched around, wild-eyed and panting. What was this? Some sort of a tunnel system? It didn't seem like it. Actually, I seemed to be in a large subterranean room reinforced by wooden beams like the kind you'd get at Home Depot, with tiki torches straight out of a backyard barbecue lining the walls to provide a dim glow of orangish light. There didn't seem to be any way out, except for a dark opening to a tunnel in one corner of the room. I felt disgusted, like I'd been swallowed by some beast, and following that tunnel would take me farther down its digestive tract. Not trusting the tunnel, I tried to think of a way to climb out of the pit, but before I could get very far in thinking of how I could achieve this, I heard a familiar, wonderful sound. It couldn't be, but there he was. I gasped. I knelt down as a broad smile overspread my face, one of overwhelming joy and disbelief. It was Bruno. It was my best buddy back to life, and he was running into my arms as fast as if he were a puppy again. I was so sure he was gone, but apparently not. After giving Bruno a generous amount of rubs and pets, while he gave me my fair share of licks and kisses, I thought of how ironically lucky it was that I'd fallen down here. If I hadn't, I wouldn't have known I'd apparently buried him alive. The question now was, how would we get out of here? Suddenly, I caught sight of 4 hooded figures standing against the walls, perfectly still, their arms raised nearly above their heads in positions suggesting they were in pain, like Han Solo frozen in carbonite. Suddenly, the group lowered their arms and all came forward in unison. Quickly, I gathered Bruno in my arms. He was smiling and panting, and didn't seem to notice the strange people. I stood, holding Bruno tight as if afraid the dark figures were here to steal him. "Hey!" I shouted as the figures approached, encircling me. I turned every which way, searching rapidly for an escape route, one that wasn't the creepy-ass tunnel yawning menacingly in the corner. What do you want? Who are you? Who the fuck are you people? I sputtered, more cowardly than I would have liked. Back the fuck off! I realized I had no choice. I darted for the tunnel, holding Bruno tight, but before I could run any farther, one of the figures glided quickly in front of me. "Stop!" it implored. The figure was tall and very skinny, with a high-pitched, female-sounding voice, but its body, as far as I could tell, was one of a male whose frame had been grotesquely stretched out of form. It was wearing a black hoodie, like one you'd buy at Walmart. How it wasn't dying of heat underground in this hot weather, I didn't know, unless, of course, it wasn't alive. Its hands seemed roughened and diseased, with long black nails appearing almost like eagle talons. It stretched forward one of these hands, and as it came toward Bruno and me, I noticed that it simply floated, its bottom half, to my amazement, seemingly being made of smoke. Maybe I'd hit my head badly when I'd fallen and was hallucinating. That, or I was dead, and the afterlife, funnily enough, was just a hole in the ground. "Please," Tall Hoodie said urgently, "I would highly suggest you not go down there. It's not yet your time, after all." I didn't respond. I turned around and met eyes with the other 3 figures, who now all had their hoods down. There were 2 men and 1 woman, all about the same height, staring at me sadly. They seemed vaguely familiar, like versions of real people or background characters you'd see in a dream. The woman had curly blonde hair styled in pigtails with rubber bands. She had pointy tusk-like teeth and an unnaturally flat nose that made her look like a boar. Her eyes nearly touched her ears. They were so far apart, giving the impression of a sloth. Her head seemed lumpy, her lower jaw was jutting out in a pronounced overbite, and she had a big brown flat mole that spread over her whole left cheek. One of the men who stood close to her had a gourd-shaped head that sprouted a patch of red hair. He had buck teeth and round little ears so low they seemed like they'd slide right off his neck. The final person, an elderly bald man who resembled a mole, looked relatively normal compared to his companions, though his face was shockingly wrinkled, and he was hunched over from scoliosis so severe it looked like he was bowing. All three of them had on the same black hoodie as their apparent leader, and unlike their leader, they clearly had legs, which were thin and shone palely in the scant light. None of them had pants on, and if they moved in a way that caused their genitals to be exposed, you'd see they were obscured by huge clumps of tangled hair and covered in strange blue-purple growths, worse than any STD you could imagine. Panting and trying not to gag, I turned back to Tall Hoodie. "What the fuck is this?" I demanded with a snort. My imagination could hardly conjure the faintest idea of what I'd stumbled onto. Family of severely inbred, deranged hillbillies who left their trailers behind? Quite possible. Elusive arcane cult hiding out here in the middle of nowhere? Also quite possible. Aliens? Monsters? Demons? Possible still, but probably less likely. "Be not afraid," said Tall Hoodie in their high-pitched, almost maternal-sounding voice. "We are the ones who dispose of the ones buried here, but we couldn't bear to do so to your little pup." They gestured to Bruno. I turned to face the others, and they all smiled at him, or at least tried their best with the twisted features they had. "We were just about to send him on his way when you happened upon us." I frowned. "Send him on his way where?" I asked. Tall Hoodie laughed, then began coughing and hacking, as if laughing were painful for them. "Why, further down," they explained, motioning toward the tunnel in the corner of the room, onto wherever he might go next. "Rather than dispose of him, you know, we just couldn't bear to do it. He's far too pure. He really is a very, very good boy." Silently, I agreed, giving a little nod. Confused, I asked, "What do you mean dispose of him?" Tall Hoodie beckoned me to follow him to the subterranean room's far wall. The others pushed me and grunted, zombie-like. A little abashed, I followed Tall Hoodie to some sort of large stone table that seemed to be an altar of sorts. On it sat a pile of wood aflame and crackling and shooting off sparks. "People always expect the smoke," Tall Hoodie explained, rather solemnly. They gestured to the smoke, and following their talon-like hand with my eyes, I could see that it was drifting upward through a gaping, roughly rectangular hole in the ceiling, which evidently was the bottom of the chimney. Whenever someone unsavory, I suppose you could say, is buried under a chimney, we waste no time burning them until they're nothing but ash, and to those we think deserve to be sent, well, to be sent on, we spare them, but always burn some of the wood we collect in their place. We've been doing this for as long as any of us can remember. Isn't that right, friends? The friends all nodded and grunted in assent. Then they all regarded me with deep sadness in their eyes, and I felt pity for them. I briefly wondered why none of them ever went on. Then a plethora of other questions swirled in my head, all of them uncomfortable to say the least. "So, is this hell?" I asked, a little afraid of the answer. Tall Hoodie considered this for a second. "It's not," they answered, "but in a strange sort of way, you could say it is." I found this non-answer frustrating, but proceeded to my next question. "Am I dead?" Tall Hoodie laughed heartily, then fell into another coughing fit. "No," they assured me. "Trust me, we'd know if you were. You're not the first to wind up down here by accident." I wasn't sure what to say to that. I considered asking Tall Hoodie if they were dead, if the others down here were dead, but I found I really didn't care. I wondered if Bruno was dead. He certainly didn't seem to be. He felt so real and warm and bursting with life and puppy-like youth in my arms. The gray even seemed to have vanished from his fur like some magic cloth had wiped away multiple years of aging. I sagged with deep sorrow when I realized this could very well mean that he was dead, turned into a beautiful soul, finally free of all the pain and suffering of advanced age, and that scary hole in the corner could be his path to doggy heaven. Was I really about to deny him that? But then I didn't really believe that this was anything other than a hole in the ground filled with a bunch of loonies out in the middle of rural Georgia. "Can I take him with me?" I asked Tall Hoodie softly. The deformed people behind me seemed to gasp. They grunted in seeming protest and reached toward me as if to grab me. Tall Hoodie glided over to stop them. "There isn't anything stopping you, I suppose," they said rather sadly. "But letting him go on might be the better option. We think so, at least." I stood for a moment, thinking. I took one last look at the tunnel, the one that led to heaven or deeper into the ground, or to somewhere unknown to me or any of the weird inbred sons of bitches that liked burning dead bodies in this pit. "I'm taking him with me," I said decidedly, and when I did, my voice seemed distant and muffled. My vision rapidly blurred as I began to faint. I let Bruno slip out of my hands. I came tumbling down, and I heard an impossibly loud, roaring sound like an avalanche, as if the pit were caving in. Next thing I knew, I was lying on the ground, back on the surface. I was drenched in sweat. The sun beat down upon me, and the soul stack towered above me, staring down at me almost resentfully. There was no sign of the pit, or that the earth had ever opened to allow me to fall into it. By my side was Bruno, standing on wobbly legs, his eyes half closed. The fur over his eyes and on his short little muzzle smattered with dirt and with patches of gray. Apparently, he hadn't died after all, but death was coming for him soon, no doubt. Quickly, I scrambled and wrapped him in his blanket. He shivered all the way home, and he whimpered occasionally, which broke my heart. When we finally made it to the house, little buddy cashed in his chips for real and for good. I took the shovel from the trunk of my car and buried him in the backyard, sobbing all the while. I sit here typing this and looking out the window at Bruno's grave. I still wonder if I denied him heaven. I wonder if I was selfish to want him to stay here with me. Maybe one of you can tell me. It's been torture. Wondering if my experience underneath the soul stack was real, or the product of overwhelming grief and overwhelming heat. I'd driven past it since, and it's fallen over, decomposed and decaying, with its bricks strewn everywhere, slowly being reclaimed by the earth like an interred corpse over the course of time. Whether little buddy was better off going down that tunnel, if it was even real, or left to fade away in my backyard, I'll never know, but at least he isn't suffering anymore, and maybe that's the most important thing.